On a quiet afternoon in a small suburban park, a group of teenage boys gathered near the playground. Their laughter echoed through the air, but it wasn't the sound of innocent fun. These boys, filled with arrogance and misplaced confidence, had spent their summer days finding amusement in tormenting others, particularly those they viewed as easy targets. Today, their sights were set on an elderly black man who sat calmly on a nearby bench reading a weathered book. The man, whom we'll call Elijah, was dressed simply. A plain shirt, worn jeans, and an old hat pulled low over his face. To the boys, he looked like just another vulnerable, easy mark. They exchanged looks and smirks, their intentions clear. One of them, a taller boy with a cocky swagger, nudged his friends. "Look at that old guy," he sneered. "Bet he can't even walk straight, let alone defend himself. Probably too old to know what's going on." The group chuckled, and with a few more whispers and taunts, they approached Elijah, circling him like wolves sizing up their prey. The man didn't seem to notice at first, or perhaps he simply chose not to react. His eyes remained fixed on his book, completely undisturbed by the growing commotion around him. One of the boys leaned in, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hey, old man, what are you reading? Or can you even read at all?" Another boy chimed in. "Yeah, shouldn't you be somewhere else? Like, I don't know, back where you came from." The remarks were harsh and pointed, their intent clear. But Elijah remained silent, his fingers gently turning the pages of his book. This only seemed to fuel the boys' cruelty, as their taunts grew louder and bolder. Elijah's calm demeanor only seemed to anger the boys further. One of them, perhaps the boldest, stepped right in front of him, blocking his view. The others watched intently as their leader took control of the situation. "Come on, old man," he said, his voice laced with aggression. "You think you're too good for us? Why don't you show us some respect?" Without warning, the boy raised his hand as if to strike Elijah. But before he could make contact, Elijah's hand shot up like lightning, gripping the boy's wrist with a strength none of them had expected. The boy froze, his arm held mid-air, unable to move. The other teens stood in stunned silence, their smirks fading as they realized the situation had taken an unexpected turn. Elijah slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking with the boys'. His expression was calm but firm. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet authority that made the boy's heart race with fear. At that moment, an elderly man walking his dog nearby stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening as he recognized Elijah. His heart skipped a beat as memories flooded back. Without a second thought, he hurried over, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Wait! Stop! Don't you boys know who this man is?" the old man shouted, waving his arms to get their attention. The teens turned to look at him, confused and nervous. The boy whose hand Elijah held began to tremble. "This is Elijah," the elderly man continued, his voice filled with awe and respect. "Elijah is a master martial artist, one of the best. I trained under him years ago. He's a former karate champion. He could wipe the floor with all of you in seconds if he wanted to." The group of teens stood there, speechless, their faces turning pale as the elderly man's words sank in. They looked at Elijah with newfound respect and fear. The boy whose wrist Elijah held stammered, I didn't know. I didn't mean to." Elijah, still holding the boy's wrist, looked at him with a small, knowing smile. "You didn't know," he said softly, finally releasing the boy's hand. "That's the problem. You acted without thinking, without understanding. That's how people get hurt." The boys, still stunned, stepped back, their bravado completely gone. The arrogance they had arrived with had vanished, replaced by the dawning realization of their mistake. They had picked a fight they couldn't win, but worse than that, they had acted out of ignorance and prejudice. The silence that followed was thick with tension, but Elijah remained as calm and composed as ever. I could have defended myself easily, Elijah said, his voice low but filled with authority. But I didn't, because what would that have solved? Hurting you wouldn't teach you anything. He looked at each of the boys in turn, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. You see, strength isn't about being able to hurt someone. It's about knowing when not to. It's about using what you have to protect, to guide, to teach. I could have taught you a lesson you wouldn't forget with my fists, but that's not the kind of lesson you need. The boys remained silent, hanging on every word. The tension in the air had shifted, replaced by something heavier. Shame, guilt, and an undeniable sense of humility. Elijah paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. You boys think it's fun, don't you? Picking on people you think are weaker than you. But you don't know their stories. You don't know who they are or what they've been through. Racism, prejudice. These things come from ignorance, from not taking the time to understand another person. He looked at the boy, who had raised his hand to strike him, his eyes softening. You're young. You've got time to change. But if you keep living with hate in your heart, it'll only destroy you in the end. The boys, heads hung low, nodded slowly. The elderly man who had recognized Elijah stepped forward, shaking his head in disbelief. Boys, you have no idea how lucky you are that he didn't react the way you expected him to. Elijah isn't just a fighter. He's a man of honor, a man who believes in teaching, not punishing. Elijah turned to the elderly man and gave him a respectful nod, then looked back at the boys. You're young, like I said, and I'm willing to forgive you. But you need to learn from this. Don't judge people by their looks or the color of their skin. Take the time to understand them. Everyone has a story, and you'll never know it if you don't open your eyes and your heart. The boys stood there, no longer full of swagger or arrogance. They were humbled in a way they hadn't expected. One of them, his voice shaky, finally spoke. We're sorry. We didn't know. Elijah smiled faintly, his expression softening even more. That's the thing about life. You can't always know everything, but you can choose how you treat others, and that choice makes all the difference. With that, Elijah turned and picked up his book once again, the peaceful old man sitting on a park bench. But the boys would never see him the same way again. They had come looking for a victim and found a teacher instead, and that lesson, the lesson of respect, humility, and the futility of hate, was one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As they walked away, the elderly man who had recognized Elijah patted the boys on the shoulder. You learned something important today. Don't forget it. The boys nodded, their heads still spinning from the experience. They had set out to bully a stranger, but instead had learned a lesson in humility, one they would never forget. And Elijah returned to his book, a small smile on his face. He had always believed in teaching through kindness and wisdom, not violence. Today had been no different, and as the sun began to set over the park, Elijah knew that the seeds of change had been planted in the hearts of those boys. 4 weeks had passed since that life-altering day at the park, and the teenage boys, once filled with arrogance and youthful ignorance, had transformed in ways they never imagined. The encounter with Elijah had left a profound mark on their lives. They had started seeing the world through a different lens, one of respect, understanding, and humility. Gone were the days of aimless bullying and mindless cruelty. The boys now carried a sense of responsibility for their actions, and it showed in how they treated others around them. One afternoon, by sheer coincidence, the same group of boys found themselves back in the park, walking along the familiar paths. Their conversations were different now, thoughtful, kind, and reflective. As they approached the same bench where Elijah had been sitting weeks earlier, they were stunned to see him once again. There he sat, just as calm and composed as before, with the same old book resting on his lap. But this time, instead of being filled with misplaced confidence and a desire to prove something, the boys approached Elijah with respect and gratitude. One of them, the same boy who had nearly raised his hand to strike Elijah, stepped forward first, his tone humble and genuine. "Sir, Elijah," he began nervously. "We didn't expect to see you here again, but we're glad we did." Elijah looked up from his book, a soft smile spreading across his face as he recognized the group. He set the book down on the bench beside him and met their eyes, nodding in acknowledgement. "I remember you, boys," he said in his calm, wise voice. "How are you all doing?" The boys exchanged glances, and one of them spoke up. "We've changed a lot since that day. You taught us something we didn't even know we needed to learn. We just wanted to thank you for that." Elijah's smile deepened, though his eyes remained as serene as ever. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied. "Sometimes life gives you a chance to see things from a different perspective. It's up to you what you do with that chance." The boys nodded, and one of them, his voice a bit hesitant, asked, "We've been talking a lot about what you said that day, about strength and wisdom, and, well, we were wondering, would you show us a little bit of what you know? Some of those moves you were trained in?" Elijah looked at them thoughtfully for a moment, his eyes studying their faces. It was clear they weren't asking out of arrogance or a desire to show off. This time, there was genuine curiosity in their request, a desire to learn something meaningful. "I'm not a trainer anymore," Elijah said, his tone gentle. "I've retired from all that. These days, I only seek peace. But I can show you a little, just enough to help you understand what real strength is. But remember, what I show you isn't for fighting or hurting others. It's for discipline, for control, and for knowing yourself. You must never misuse what I teach." The boys agreed, nodding eagerly, understanding the gravity of his words. Elijah stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and graceful. He led the boys to a small patch of grass nearby, away from the benches and other park-goers. He then demonstrated a few simple hand movements, basic blocks, defensive stances, and calm breathing techniques. His movements were precise yet fluid, like water flowing naturally. The boys watched in awe, trying to mimic his actions as best they could, though they knew they could never match his mastery. Elijah smiled at their efforts. "It's not about how fast or powerful you are," he said, "but how much control you have over your mind and body. Strength without control is dangerous. Always remember that." After a few minutes, Elijah stopped, raising a hand to signal the end of their impromptu lesson. "That's enough for now," he said with a smile. "Like I said, I'm retired, and I'm not a teacher anymore. But you've learned enough to start understanding what real strength means. And remember, never use what you've learned to hurt others." The boys nodded eagerly, their faces glowing with both respect and gratitude. They felt humbled by the small demonstration, realizing that real strength was far more about control and character than physical power.